this is the Provoked Prawn, and in this video I'm going to show you how to set up the HAVN HS420 VGPU to look something like this with Corsair's iCue Link system, including reverse blade fans and a 420mm all-in-one cooler, either top-mounted or side-mounted, and an Astral 5090 from Asus as well included in there. Specs of this full build are in the description down below, as well as timestamps so that you can jump to relevant points in the video. I'm going to start by breaking down the case and talking about the various different things about it. It's an interesting case to build in because it requires you to follow some steps. If you do things in the wrong order, it becomes a little bit tricky. So it's kind of an interesting jigsaw puzzle of a build. First of all, you need to remove the top panel, and then you'll see there are multiple screws along the top that you need to remove in order to pull that glass panel off. And then there's more screws on the front and the back and the sides. So basically little screws are all over the place to take this off. And then as you can see, you can then remove the back panel, which has the mesh filtering on it to protect from dirt and dust ingress. And then you should find access to the rear. Now you'll note the obviously accessories tray is tied to the back of the SSD tray. And then you have a lot of space for other things, including routing of cable management and such. You'll also notice there are two fan controllers in here. We're not going to be using those in this build, but I have covered them in a previous video on the case that I'll link to in the description if you do want to know about them. The case is a very nice looking one, as you've seen once you get to building it. And it's very spacious with plenty of options, including either putting SSD and hard disk drives into the side tray or swapping it out for a radiator or fans, as I've shown later on. You also do need to make sure you remove the back panel so you can install the rear fans, and you'll notice there's also a mesh panel on the bottom one. What we're aiming to do here is to end up with an intake fan on that bottom area and then an exhaust at the top, and that will then help with the airflow. So we need to remove a lot of things from here. There's a screw at the rear at the bottom here that you need to remove in order to be able to remove the fan tray, which you can see lifts from the rear and then comes out. It also has little clips on the front that hold it in place that you need to lower in. Once you've done that, you can then access the rear fan bracketing, and you need to remove the little screws from each of the corners there. This shows the interesting way you have to sort of think about the logic of how to build in it, because to get one of the screws out, you first also have to remove the vertical GPU mount, which you can see is held in place here with a couple of thumb screws onto the side there, and then some screws around the back as well that you need to take out. This is actually quite awkward to get out because you need to first of all remove these screws as well. So there's a lot of little screws to remove in order to access other things. But we need to take this out of the way anyway to be able to install the motherboard. So unscrew that, set it aside carefully, and then we'll prep that later on for installing the GPU into it and seating it once the motherboard's installed and other bits. But you'll also find that this adds some complexity later on as well that I'll get to. Remove that final screw and you can take out the fan bracket. Now it's worth noting that that fan bracket is for 120mm fans. So if you want to install 120mm, you can use this. If you're doing 140, you have to first take that out to install the fans, which we'll get to later on. Now in the accessories kit, you'll find a number of different things, including a VESA mount if you want to put a screen into the build, some anti-static gloves, a number of screws with various different markings on them, obviously some plastic cable ties for tidying things up a bit, some clips to include into the case to neaten the cables up in the various different brackets that they come through, and more. Note the labeling on the bags of the screws because it will make your life a lot easier when you get to installing the motherboard and SSDs and other things, for example. So watch out for that. And then you can use these gloves to protect your components while installing them, and they'll help with dispersing static. Now for this build, I'm using the Maximus Hero Z890 motherboard, and I'm going to show you the prep for that and the things that I'm using in it. If you're using a different board or you know what you're doing, you can always fast forward using the timestamps down below if you'd like. But we're also using the Core Ultra 9 285K, so we're installing that carefully by seating it down into the socket with a little gold triangle pointing to the bottom corner, seating the lever down over the top and readying that. Now I'm also going to be using multiple NVMe SSDs in this build. I'm actually going to do a separate review of this motherboard, talking about why this might potentially be an issue and things to be aware of when doing this. But I use multiple drives for various different reasons, and this motherboard enables you to actually install loads, as you can see in here when you remove the housing. If you are installing NVMe SSDs and using them throughout, do make sure you remove any stickers from the motherboard heat shielding around the motherboard itself and on the heat shields above and below. Leave the thermal pads in place and leave the stickers on the drives as you insert them in there. The stickers on the drives can actually make a difference to the heat, and the heat shielding on the motherboard is also very important to make sure your drives keep cool and run well. If they do overheat, then you might well have an issue. And this actually became a problem for me with one of these drives because the 5090 is so big. So I did a separate video on that I'll link to that you might find interesting and potentially useful as well. But I realize most people probably won't be using quite this many drives, so you probably won't have that issue. If you're using just one, I'd recommend using the top slot on the motherboard because you generally get the best speed out of that. And as you can see with this board, it's pretty easy to push the drives in and then clip them into place with the little plastic clips on the end. Just need to make sure you remove the stickers from the thermal pads because these thermal pads help with the conductivity of heat and cooling the drives down. And then you seat that heat shielding back over the top, which not only protects the drives, but also helps to cool them as well, and actually works pretty well. I've done a separate video on the testing of these things to show how much difference it makes with and without these, and my experience is much better to use them where possible. Then I'm using Kingston's RAM here, which is 48 gigabytes of 8,000 mega transfers per second DDR5 RAM, superbly fast with XMP turned on, and it has some nice RGB lighting as well. So that's the setup of the motherboard. Next, I'm going to show you the prep of the all-in-one cooler because that will also be going alongside the motherboard when you set it up before we put it in the case. So we're using the iCue Link H170i RGB, which is a 420mm all-in-one cooler. Comes with its own pre-installed fans, but we're also going to be swapping those out in a little while because I wanted to make sure the fans match throughout the system and that it end up looking really nice with this contrasting black and white effect. Also, you can't get this cooler in white, so it only comes in black, something to bear in mind. I've also done a separate wiring and setup guide for iCue Link system, if you're curious, which I'll link to in the description, which will help with a lot of depth on how it all works. Now, when you're first unboxing it, take care not to do what I'm about to do, which is to accidentally pull off the plastic protective housing over the top of the pump. And you can see what I've done there is I've managed to damage the thermal paste ever so slightly in the corner there. So you need to make sure this plastic cap is in place throughout most of your build until the very last minute so that it doesn't get damaged. As you can see, the fans on the radiator are pre-installed and they're set to exhaust, so it'll actually be blowing through the radiator and logically out of the top of your case if you're top mounting it. So pretty standard and straightforward for you. On the radiator, you'll find several ports, one including the USB-C port that you won't need potentially, and then two additional ports for connecting the fans up and then connecting the radiator and the pump to the controller that you can see here. So we've got several cables that need to be plugged in. For ease of viewing, I'm going to lay these all out for you and make it really clear for you how to do it. Obviously, you didn't install everything and wire it up once it's installed in the case, so I'll show you that later on as well. This controller is able to control up to 24 iCue Link devices, 12 on each port on the left and right hand side. You then have additional cables that you need to plug into that to power it and connect things up. You get this small cable which connects from the fans to the radiator, and then a longer one which connects from the radiator to the iCue Link controller. So those things then connect up nicely together and ensure the power and lighting goes through properly. You then have this PCIe power adapter, which requires to connect to your power supply unit, and I'll show you how to wire that up later on, and USB connection, which is important so that you can control everything via Corsair's iCue software. And so it's essential that you plug both of those connectors in, and then you have this small connector which connects to the control box and to the CPU fan header on your motherboard to ensure the motherboard can detect that you've got a cooler in place. Now you have the small connector that I was talking about. Make sure that you connect it up to the fan. Notice there's a little thing sticking out of this connector here. On the other side, you'll find there's a blank connection, so don't plug it in on the wrong side. Plug it in there, make sure it connects up properly, and then plug it into the radiator. So this is passing the signal from the fans to the radiator, and then the other cable plugs into the radiator and passes through to the controller. So you can see that here. You have these little plastic tabs on there, so you can easily pull those out and adjust them if necessary. There's also a USB-C connection on the radiator, but that's only necessary if you have the LCD screen for the cooler. So the long cable then plugs into one of the ports on the iCue Link controller. This controller can also be used for additional fans in the case. As you've seen, I've got additional fans that I'm going to be plugging in here, including standard blade and reverse blade fans, and they'll plug in and daisy chain up on the other side. Now, just a quick look at the cabling again, make it nice and easy for you. I'm going to show you this inside the build later on, but I want to make it nice and clear. Make sure you plug these cables in on the controller, so the CPU fan header, the USB connection, and then the power connector. You need to make sure these are all plugged in on the controller that you're going to be using here and connected up properly. So I want to show you where to wire those up and how to connect them up. I want to do it now so it's really easy and visible to see, and you can understand the logic of how it works to make sure you get everything plugged in properly. So 3 cables, fairly straightforward, with perhaps the PCIe power cable being a little bit more tricky, so it's worth bearing that in mind. For reference, I'm using the Maximus Hero Z890 motherboard, which you can see the CPU fan header is on the top right of. That's mostly the same across most modern motherboards. We just need to plug that little cable into it so that your motherboard recognizes there's a cooler installed and the BIOS doesn't complain and it boots nicely and you don't have any issues there. So that's that connection. Then you have the USB cable, which plugs in the bottom and middle usually on most modern motherboards. On this one, it's slightly off to the right, but you should find it's got a USB marking on it there. And you'll notice that there's one pin missing on the motherboard and on the cable, so you can only plug it in one way. So you make sure you plug that in. Now, for demonstration purposes of the powering, I'm going to use this Leland Edge power supply unit, which I'm going to do a separate wiring guide on, but you can also use a Corsair power supply. This is just for demonstration purposes. What's important is you're going to need one of the PCIe power cables that you'd usually use for your graphics card for the controller. So you need to make sure you've got a spare one of those. You can see that this power supply comes with 4 of these cables, so it shouldn't be an issue. Now on one end this is marked PSU, on the other end PCIe, but it plugs into the PCIe port on modular power supply on one end. Make sure it's fully secured. On the other end you'll find it splits into 2 parts. This is the 6-pin part which needs to plug into the adapter for the iCue Link controller. You'll notice there's a little plastic notch on it and a hook that goes over the top of that. It's a little bit fiddly, but you do need to make sure that's pushed all the way in and secured properly. Then we're onto motherboard prep. So you need the Intel hardware packet here. And what we're looking for is the LGA 1700 socket standoffs and the backplate for that, so we can finally prep the motherboard ready for installing this cooler later on. So you peel off the little 3M sticker cover off the back of that, adjust the notches on the back plate itself, and then secure it through the motherboard. Now I'm doing this outside of the case, so it's really easy to see and to access so that you can easily connect this up and plug it in. You might be able to do it inside your case if you've already installed the motherboard, but it's just a little bit less fiddly like this, I find, and it's easier to secure without any issues. And then flip it over and you'll see we have some standoff screws that need to be secured in place. 4 standoff screws that are the same length and thickness on either side, so it doesn't matter which way around you put them, but secure those into the 4 holes from that back plate that have come through there. You need to make sure you secure them nice and tight so that they're nice and secure in those sockets. Make sure you do that in all 4 corners, so it's all secured up nicely and ready, and then the cooler is going to sit down over the top of that once we've gone about the installation process into the system. So I'm going to show you the steps for doing that. So obviously installing the motherboard into the case and then securing it down onto the standoffs in the case as well, and making sure that's ready. So you want to look for these screws in this bag marked motherboard and 3.5-inch hard drive installation, and then you need to secure the motherboard in multiple screws. So it's 3 across the bottom, 3 across the middle, 3 across the top to secure to those standoffs that are in place in the case, and that'll then secure that down so it's steady and ready for everything else. And we'll get to the rest of the prep for the all-in-one cooler later on. Now I'm going to show you the front panel connections and other things. So these are the USB-C and USB-A cables. The big fat one is the USB-A connection. So this is for the ports on top of the motherboard, so you can plug those things in. USB-C is the little one, which plugs in on the right-hand side here, just below the 24-pin power connector. And then the USB-A is that flatter one, which has a little notch on it. Now, both of these cables can only plug in one way, so you have to watch out for that. Obviously, the notch makes it obvious where the USB-A one plugs in, but the USB-C needs to be flipped until it clicks into place. So you find you can't force it in. You have to make sure it's pushed in properly. And then you can adjust both cables using those little plastic clips on the side there to neaten things up a little bit. Then we've got the front panel connection and the HD audio, which is the power button and the 3.5mm cables. These run down the bottom there and come in from underneath. For the front panel, you're looking on the right-hand side of the motherboard. You should see something like this where it says F panel on it. And you'll line that up. And again, this is missing a pin, so you can't get it wrong in terms of where you plug it in. And the same sort of logic applies to the F audio, which is the HD audio, which plugs on the left-hand side. And again, there's a pin missing there. So just line that up with the cable, plug it into the connector, and that's both of those sorted out at the bottom. So right and left either side. Next, I'm going to show you the setup and prep of the power supply unit. In this case, I'm using the Leland Edge Gold. I'm going to show you the wiring logic for how you connect everything up in a similar sort of way to what I've already done with the all-in-one cooler, for example, so that you can see where all the cables plug in and the logic for how that would work outside of the case, so it's really clear to see. And then I'll show you it installed into the build. Now, obviously, this is just an option on your power supply and what you're using. Other ones are available, including Corsairs that would work quite nicely. But this one's nice because it has this USB thing included on it, which is a hub that allows you to plug in multiple USB devices to it, power it from the power supply unit, and then send that signal to the motherboard. I've done a separate wiring and setup guide on this if you're interested. But now I just want to show you how to set up the power supply so that you know everything you need to know for installing it into the system and wiring it up nicely with the things that you're going to be using. So we're going to start with the 24-pin power cables and the motherboard powering. Now, I'd recommend removing the fan hub to start with. Don't put that in place just yet because it's easier to plug all the cables in beforehand and at least to see things. So we're going to start with the motherboard connectivity and the 24-pin power cable. This is this large one here that you can see on one end is split into two parts, on the other end connects to the motherboard. You'll notice there are cable combs on here as well, which will become important in a minute. And this connectivity basically plugs into this part that's marked M/B 18 plus 10P on this part of the power supply on the edge here. And you need to make sure you plug in both parts of that connector, obviously, and to make sure that they're fully seated and pushed all the way in. You'll see there's a little clip on the side there that needs to be pushed in. You should hear it click into place and feel it connect up as well. So this is the power cable that plugs into the right-hand side of the motherboard. So you can see a Maximus Hero Z890 here as a demonstration of what's what. And on this board, there's actually two connectors, the 24-pin power connector and then a PCIe power connector just below that. Now, generally, you won't have a PCIe power connector on most motherboards, so you just be looking for that 24-pin power cable on the right-hand side. But just in case you have a similar board, I'll show you the PCIe power in a second as well. So with the 24-pin power connector, it turns around and plugs in on the right-hand side there, and you'll see there's a little clip that hooks over that. So you need to make sure this is pushed all the way in and clicks into place, and you can only put it in one way round. Obviously, don't do this until you've fully installed it in your build. But I want it to be really clear where you plug the cables in and how that connects up. And so make sure you don't actually plug that in until the end, otherwise you will find it difficult to remove. Now, there's additional cable combs included in the box because you'll see that the cable itself, once you plug it in, is a little bit messy. You can try and thread your cables through here to tidy things up a bit. Now, I'll admit I found this really fiddly and awkward and frustrating and annoying. My patience levels are really low, so I ended up just abandoning it. But if you have the patience and the skill and nimble hands, then perhaps you can use this to tidy up the cables a little bit more. There is one of these included with the cable anyway, but you can use additional. I ended up just using plastic cable ties because it made it look neater, and most of that's going to be hidden at the back anyway, so it won't be a problem. Now, there's CPU and EPS power cables at the top left. Most motherboards will have two of these. I'd recommend plugging in both cables into these ports. Sometimes you'll find there's one 8-pin and one 4-pin. Sometimes just one 8-pin, sometimes two 8-pins, as I've got in this instance. You'll see the cables are marked CPU on one end and then PSU 08 on the other end. That's the part that plugs into the power supply unit, and obviously the CPU part plugs into the motherboard. So you plug them into the ports marked PCIe and CPU that you can see in the top row here. Just find a spare port and plug those into it and connect those up on one end, and then the other end will plug into the top left of the motherboard. So on this motherboard, you can see them up there, little grey ones. And again, same sort of logic as the previous ports in that they have little clips on them and hooks. So you can only connect them up one way round. So you shouldn't find that you have to force it. It should click in pretty easily. Now, one of the cables, you can also split that in half. So if you do have a motherboard that only requires one 8-pin and one 4-pin, and this is how you do it. You just split that in half, and then you just plug half of the cable in instead of the whole thing. But this motherboard requires two 8-pins. So we make sure it's clicked together and then seat it into that port. And that's how that would plug in and connect up. Pretty easy. And as you can hear, there's a little click when you plug it in. And that's the basic wiring for the standard powering of a motherboard. You need to make sure all these cables are connected up in order to make sure it powers on. But there's this additional PCIe power cable for this motherboard, as I said. And this plugs into the CPU and PCIe ports as well. You'll see it's slightly different. It has PCIe written on one end of it and PSU08 on the other, but it plugs into the similar ports, so the CPU and PCIe power ports up here on this row. You plug one end in there, and then the other end, pinch the cables together, make sure they're knotted together in there, and then push it into the port. And you can see that from this angle, again, with those plastic clips. Now, this is fairly unusual, but it's a high-end motherboard, so it requires that additional PCIe power. This is the same cables that you'd use for your graphics card. You do have 4 of those cables included in the box, so in theory it should be fine. And you can see we have 4 cables, 3 of which are single connectors. So a single connector on one end, and then a PCIe power connector on the other. And then there's a 4th one, which is this pigtail affair, which has 2 connectors on it. So you've got 4 cables, so in theory it should be fine for that motherboard and for your graphics card as well. So next we're going to get on to GPU wiring. So we've got the B580 from ASRock, the Steel Legend. Now this requires 2 PCIe power connectors on it, as you can see on the side here. It's similar sort of logic with older NVIDIA cards and with AMD GPUs as well. So you probably find you have to use 2 or 3 or maybe 1 8-pin PCIe power connector. It's going to vary from graphics card to graphics card, but this one requires it, and so does the 3090. So this Gigabyte 3090 that I've got also requires 2 8-pin PCIe power connectors. So no matter what you're using with these sorts of logic, you have to plug 2 cables in. So make sure you use those individual cables, plug the PSU end into the CPU and PCIe row at the top, and then the other end will plug into the GPU. So in this instance for these GPUs, I'd use 2 cables, one plugged in there, and then the other one you can see is a little bit fiddly. You have to push the cables together, so you can see there's this little notch on the edge there that you have to sort of line up and pinch together, and then you have to push it in and make sure it's fully seated. Just be careful with this, because if that additional bit comes loose and it doesn't fully seat in, then your GPU might not get the power it needs. So you do need to make sure it's pushed all the way in, and then slide it into your graphics card, and you should find it a little bit fiddly, but it will push in there. Now, this might be easier when it's in the case, or it might not. Depends how much access you have to your build, but I like to show these things outside of the case so it's really clear and easy for you to see what you're meant to be doing. So pinching those cables together, pushing those in, make sure they're clicked all the way in, fully seated, and that'll ensure that the GPU gets maximum power and gives you the performance that you should be able to get from it. Otherwise, you might find it's underpowered and not doing the job that it should. But as you can see, those are the cables required for these 2 GPUs. You might require a 3rd one. Alternatively, you might be using a newer GPU from NVIDIA, the 40 or 50 series, which is that newer style of connector on it, which has multiple pins to it rather than those 8-pin PCIe power cables. Leland's Edge Gold power supply has this 600 watt capable power cable. If you've bought the high-end 1000 watt model and upwards, there's different models available, different power cables. But this is used for something like powering 5090, which is what I've been using it for in my system. Your 40 and 50 series NVIDIA GPUs generally come with this adapter included in the box, which takes multiple PCIe power cables and puts them into one single connector that plugs into the graphics card. It looks hideous, so this power connector is much better. You can use it on 40 and 50 series. I've been using it on the 4090, for example, which you can see here. That's what the connector looks like. You can see it's quite a bit different from a 8-pin PCIe power connectors. Instead, it's multiple pins. Now, it plugs in on the right-hand side of the power supply unit. Both ends are the same, so it doesn't matter which way around you do it. Plugs in, but you've got to make sure you push it all the way in so you can't see the blue pins anymore. That's important. It needs to be fully seated in so you don't have any problems with melting and other issues. Now, Leland says they've improved the connectors on this, so it's even better anyway, so you shouldn't see any problems with any of that. You can plug it directly into a 40 series or 50 series GPU without any worries. Now we're on to SATA connectors. So these are for things like hard disk drives, SSDs, other fan controllers. These are daisy chain cables, so you can see one end plugs into the power supply unit, then you've got multiple L-shaped connectors on it across the cable. You get 3 cables included in the box, slightly different types, as you can see. The third one is basically very close together ports, so you can see these connectors are all close together. If you've got a rack in your system with multiple SSDs in it, for example, where you can plug those in quite easily with that cable. These plug into the SATA and Molex connectors on the bottom left of the edge power supply, and then you can plug in your SSDs into them. Note this is a L-shaped connector, so it can only plug in one way. It's got this little notch down the edge of it, so you need to make sure it's lined up properly so that you'll be able to plug it in. Good news is, though, you can use one cable to connect multiple different drives to it. You can use SSDs and hard disk drives on the same cable if you want to, or multiple SSDs, and easily power them with this cable, so it's very nice. As you can see, it's flat and thin as well, so it's really easy to route through your case and to keep tidy in the build too. So multiple connectors for this. Now, as I've mentioned, you might use them for fan controllers, so older generations of Leland's fan controllers require them, and SATA power is also required for other things. You'll also have these data cables that should be included with your motherboard that you plug into the other port on the SSD, and then those will plug into the motherboard to make sure the signals pass through from the drive and the motherboard back and forth. So they plug in on the right-hand side here and the bottom right, and then that's that set up for wiring those in and getting those set up nicely. So hopefully that's helped with those. And then you have this PATA cable, which is used for other things. Generally, you don't use this very often, but it might be used for a custom loop system for a liquid pump, for example, a pump reservoir combo. You'll find that this cable is used for that. That plugs into the SATA and Molex connectors and then into your whatever thing you're using. Now let's have a look at the USB hub. So this is a really nice inclusion to the power supply unit because it gives you the option to connect up multiple devices. If you're throwing in Leland fans into the system, you'll often find that you need a controller for it. And then when you've got that controller, you'll need to plug in a USB connection to your motherboard. You often only have one USB connection, so this essentially allows you to plug in multiple USB connectors to this hub instead, and then power it from the power supply unit. So you'll notice it's got a clip on the top that you can just slot it in, and then it will get its power from there. And then you have another connector like this that runs from that hub to the motherboard, taking the signal for all the different things that you've got connected up to it through to the motherboard really easily. Now, this is really handy. I usually recommend purchasing an additional powered hub from NZXT or Corsair to solve this problem. So if you've got an all-in-one cooler and multiple fans and other things that require USB connections, this can be a good solution. Plug your USB cable from the motherboard signal port to the motherboard itself. Obviously, that sends the signal for anything that's connected from this hub into it. You need to make sure it's connected up to the power supply so that it gets powered, because if you plug in multiple devices, you'll find that they won't get the signal through to the motherboard without it. USB connections can only plug in one way because they're missing a pin on them, so it's easy to work out where that goes, and then you can connect it up. Now, it's worth noting there are some caveats to this. If you're using LCD fans, like the TL LCD, you can't use port 1, which is the one closest to the motherboard signal, so don't use that first port. If you try and plug that into that first port, it'll be a problem. So use 2, 3, and 4, which are the ones further away from the white port. The manual specifically says this, so just watch out if you do that. You might have problems where these devices just don't work properly if they're plugged into that first port. So it's worth bearing in mind and something to think about. Now, this hub can be mounted to your case. So it will magnetically mount to your case if you've got space. And then instead of plugging it into the power supply unit, you can get it further away, but you will require a PCIe power cable for this. So the PCIe power cable plugs in, obviously, the CPU and PCIe power connectors, and then will plug into the USB and fan hub. Obviously, it needs powering, especially if you're using USB connections, but also if you're going to be plugging fans into it. You need to pinch it together like you would for your graphics card and then pop that in. Now, you don't need to plug this cable in if the hub is slotted onto the power supply. Don't do that because then it's getting power from both ends of it and it would break. It'll be bad. But if you want to put it further away in your case, somewhere in a useful position where you can plug in other cables, then you can do it. So you have choices here, which is pretty nice. Going a lot of flexibility in how to use it and where you're going to connect it up. Although you do obviously end up then using an additional PCIe power cable, which isn't ideal. But you could plug 4 USB devices into it and then USB signal from the motherboard to the device and back and forth. So it makes life a lot easier and is really handy. Now, you can actually do more with it than just 4 as well. You can use splitters. So these additional things that I happen to have, additional purchases, they're not included with the power supply unit. But you can see we've got a USB splitter, which is 2 connectors on one end and 1 connection on the other. You can plug that into every port apart from the first one. So again, don't use that first port. That means that you can have up to 7 USB devices theoretically connected to this hub. So you can use splitters on 3 of the ports, and then you can have multiple splitters basically and multiple USB devices. Now, you probably won't have this many, but if for some reason you do, then you can do that. And you can connect up a mass of USB things and really make your life easier. So with that logic explored, we're going to install the power supply. Notice how it goes in with the fan facing outwards towards the back of the case and then secures with 4 PSU screws from the original bag in the accessories box. And then you need to run the cable through the various different channels. So we've got the 2 8-pin CPU power cables running up here on the right-hand side from the back view and then plugging in the top left here, making sure you push those all the way until they click into place. Then the 24-pin power cable, which will be a little bit more tricky because it's a bit fatter. You have to thread it through those various areas and through the Velcro ties and secure it down and then push it through the gap up here and run it through to the other side. Now, this had that little plastic clip on it, so you have to make sure it goes through the right way round, but then pushes into that port on the right-hand side there and clicks into place. Can use the cable combs at this point to tidy those things up and neaten them up a little bit. Then plug the PCIe power cable in just below that. Again, if you're using a different motherboard, you might not have this connector to worry about. But in this instance, you can see we've got that set up there. So now for this build, I'm using Corsair's iCue Link LX140 and 140R RGB fans. So reverse blade fans. So I want to talk to you about the reverse blade first of all. So these are designed to pull air in from intake, so we're going to use them on the bottom of the case, and yet let you see the fan blades still. So you can easily connect these together, wire them into your system, and then have really nice RGB lighting and good cooling. Now these are interlocking fans, which have these little special connectors that push into the port that you can see there, and then another connector at the bottom, which doesn't actually pass any signal, that slots in there. And then this enables you to then put the fans together, clip them together, and then essentially it's sending the RGB signal and the fan power signal from one fan to the next once you plug it into the controller that I showed you earlier on. It's the same sort of controller logic that you'd use with the all-in-one cooler as well, but it has its own controller included with a double pack of fans. So with a dual pack, you get 2 fans and you get the controller and you get the cables. So you could cleverly use this system to only plug in 1 controller into your system. I actually ended up with 2, as I'll show you later on, but initially just 1, because you can put up to 24 devices into your system using this controller. You do need a USB connection and then the PCIe power connection for it to make sure it's powered properly and that it also is able to be controlled via Corsair's iCue software. But you can put 24 devices in there, 12 on either side, so you can connect loads of different things together if you daisy chain them up cleverly and work that into your system nicely. But if you do end up with 2 controllers like I do, then you're going to need 2 ports on your motherboard, so 2 USB connections, or obviously you could use the Edge USB hub. You'll also need a spare PCIe power connector for this controller, which is fine if you're using the 5090 like I am, because we end up having these spare because we're not using them for a graphics card, so it's fine. But it's worth bearing in mind this power requirement is needed, so you might need to make sure you've got spare cables. It's something to keep in mind with your build and when you're speccing it out to make sure you've got everything you're going to be needing there. But that's the basic wiring of the standard fan setup. But the idea initially is to use one of those reverse blade fans at the bottom of the case. So what's going to happen here is basically install a reverse blade fan at the bottom left there, and that will be an intake fan, which will then set up and install. Now, the wiring of these fans is a little bit tricky around the back of the case here, but it's interesting because basically you're looking to run one of the connectors from the fan, obviously either to another fan or through to a hub. Now, I had an issue here where I was essentially trying to wire this fan and then run the cable from here through to the bottom to then plug into the fans at the bottom. I want to show you the problem that I came across there. But before that, what you want is these little plastic washers that seat into the rubber mounts around the fan. So they go into these holes here and fill in that gap. And they were in there initially when you first remove the bracketing from the back of the case. I then use the fan screws that came with Corsair's fans, which are really easy to install, to go through that rubber washer and through that plastic housing into the fan brackets and install it into there. So this is a 140mm fan installed into the case, and that's how you do it at the bottom. Note, as I said, this is the reverse blade fan, which is installed here at the bottom to help support the fans that are going to be on that bracket, blowing air onto the graphics card later on. Now, the wiring from this, I ran from that fan and tried to get through this gap, with the idea being to basically stretch to the end of the tray and plug into the fans once I mounted them on there. But the problem I actually ended up having was that this cable isn't quite long enough in order to do that. So I want to show some of my mistakes that I made so that you don't make the same error, because this basically becomes a problem. I ended up having to wire the fans slightly differently, and I'll show you as we go through how I did it. But the important thing with this is you do need to think about the logic of how these cables are connecting up when you're going about the iCue Link setup build. So here what I'm doing is installing 3 more reverse blade fans onto that bottom tray. So you've got some long screws included in there. And what I'm thinking about here is, as you can see, looking at the ports and where they are on the fans so that they sit in a logical way. But you've got these long screws included in the accessories box for the case that pass through the fans and then secure into that tray as you've seen it. So we're basically setting these up so that they'll be helping with more intake. They slot into the bottom here and then notching at the back. Now, one thing to note is I've also made a mistake here where I've not installed the plastic bracket, which I'll show you later, which I should have done. And so don't make the same mistake that I did, because it becomes a problem later on. But if you see, I'm trying to run that cable from the rear fan through the holes in here to then end up basically coming out at the end and plugging in. But the problem is it's not quite long enough. It doesn't quite stretch far enough, so it's not actually possible to do, which is a bit of a problem. But I do end up working out how to plug the fans in anyway, running another connector through. I was hoping to keep things nice and neat in this way. But this is that plastic housing that I was talking about that I forgot to install at this point. So you need to put this in. This is included with the accessories box. Basically, this is designed to help push the air, reflect it from the glass back up towards your graphics card. So you need to secure it to the back of the fan tray once you've installed your fans to it. There's 3 screws that you need to screw into this tray, and then that'll then slot into place. The difficulty with this is if you don't get the installation right, it becomes a bit more fiddly later on. So here you can see a shot of me realizing my error much further on in the build, when I've already installed the graphics card and I've cabled the fans in, and I've got to take the tray out to then install this plastic bit on there, which then presents a problem because it's pretty difficult to do. So make sure you install that first of all before you install the fan tray into the system, back into the case, because it'll make life easier. You don't want to end up in this position like I did, having to mess about like this, because it's pretty awkward to do, as you can see. And then that would then be seated down in there like that. And as you can see, it's pretty difficult as well because of the way the graphics card is sitting. It's actually potentially getting in the way there as well. So it's quite fiddly to do and to seat that back down. So a couple of things to bear in mind. This is what I was talking about with the logic of how you sort of have to do things in the right order in this case. Otherwise, it just becomes a bit difficult. So as well as the reverse blade fans, I've got standard LX140 RGB fans. These are the standard fans, and you can see they're different at the rear and the different design of the fan blades. These are essentially standard fans, so they mount to the top of the case. So the top left Same sort of logic for the installation, except now it's an exhaust fan, so the blades are facing inwards with the standard blade fan, and you're putting that into place and then securing it with the Corsair screws through the plastic washers and through the rubber washers mounted at the back of the case there, securing it each of the 4 corners. Now take note when you're securing how you put the fan in and where the connectors sit, because what we're going to do is basically connect one fan to the other fan. However, unfortunately, what I've found is the short cable that's designed for this won't quite stretch. It's a bit too much of a gap between those two, so you can't actually use that, which isn't ideal because this is what that's meant for. It's for daisy chaining those fans together. It's not a major problem because you should have spare over these longer cables, so you can plug one connector into that and then the other connector into the bottom fan. Ideally, generally, these are used to connect from the fans to the controller, but it doesn't really matter. It's the same sort of logic. It just means we could have excess cable to sort of hide away at the back here, but that's fine because the housing for the case will make it basically invisible anyway by the time you've finished. But obviously, we need to make sure these two cables are connected together so that these two fans are connected up. And then what you want to do is basically run a cable from this fan through to the back of the case so that we can then connect that up to other things. So you're basically linking one fan to the next. Now I had to remove a couple of screws in order to plug this cable into here so that I could then run that through to the rear. But the logic is pretty sound, and it does mean that you can then run these cables through the gaps that are designed for exactly this. And that's one of the nice things about this case is it has various holes for running your fan cables through and other connectors so that you can keep things nice and neat. So we can just essentially slot this iCue Link cable through from there and then run it in. Now I want to look at the mounting the all-in-one cooler. Now I'm going to start with top mounting it, and then I'm going to show you how to side mount it later on if you'd like to do the same. And I've done a review on the all-in-one cooler and its performance in this case that I'll link to in the description, which will show you the difference beforehand so you can get an idea of that. If you're top mounting it, you can remove the radiator tray from the top. It's held in place with 2 screws there. You can take this top tray out the top of the case and then secure the radiator to it. Obviously, you could just do it while it's mounted in place, but it is pretty easy to take it out this way. Notice that I'm putting the tubes on the right-hand side of the all-in-one cooler in this instance, so they don't interfere with any fans, and then use the small screws with the washers that are included with the cooler to secure the radiator to the bracket here, and basically make sure it's set up and secured nicely. Note how the brackets that re-secure it to the front of the case are on the right hand side here along with the tube, so you've got it facing the right way, so make sure you're doing that as you go through, and then you should find that that's nicely secured and ready to install. As you can see, I've swapped out the fans for the LX fans so that it matches throughout the system, and it's pretty straightforward to do that and then connect it up. So what I've done now is I've run a cable from those back fans. So those 2 back fans, run a cable from that, it's the iCue Link cable, with the idea being that it could then connect it to these fans on the radiator, because then they connect to the radiator and then that connects to the controller. So this is linking those fans together, as I said, easily connecting them up from one fan to the next fan to the ones on the system. And then when you're in iCue software, you can then tell it which fans are on the radiator and which fans are in the case and adjust that accordingly. It's pretty straightforward setup. Then I run the cables from here. So you've got to remember to connect the fans that are on the radiator to the radiator, as I showed earlier on in the video, because I removed the original fans and I've put these LX fans on there just to match the system. I need to make sure those connectors are in place, which is something I forgot to do initially, and then run the cable from the radiator through to the rear to plug into the controller for that, so those are all nicely set up. So that's the standard wiring of those fans on the top and the side, and the bottom fans will be wired in separately. Then we're going to seat the pump down over the CPU. Now notice obviously the thermal paste is pre-applied. As I mentioned earlier, I've slightly damaged it. But before you seat it down, you'll also want to remove the plastic wrapping around the pump head. Take that out of the way. And so then you can secure it. Notice the tubes are on the right hand side here as well. You don't have to do that. You can actually adjust it in different positions, and then the Corsair logo will come off and you can put that into a different position if you want. But I find on the right hand side here is optimal for this installation. And then we need to use the thumb screws to secure it down over the standoffs that we put in place earlier on. So you use these thumb screws in each of the 4 corners, and I'd recommend using a screwdriver to make sure they're tightened all the way up. Don't force them, but just make sure they're tightened so they won't go any further. And so that will make sure it's secured properly and the cooling works nicely. And then I'm also swapping that out, pulling that pump cap off and using the VRM Fan upgrade, which is an additional purchase. But I thought it would look nice in this system and add to the RGB lighting and the effects there. So then the cables from the bottom 3 fans that I showed you earlier on are plugging into the controller on one side. So these are the fans mounted to that fan tray that sits on the bottom. And then the other connector includes those 2 fans at the rear and the 3 fans on the radiator and the radiator itself. Notice that the controller is magnetic, so in most cases it will attach to the back really easily, but in this one there's a plastic backing on the back of the case. So we use the 3M stickers that are included with the iCue Link controller, and they're double-sided, so you can basically peel the stickers off either side, stick it to the controller, then stick it to the back of the case and secure it there. So you can secure the controller into the system pretty easily like that. Then obviously you need to remember that you've got to plug in the cables as I showed you earlier on. So you need to make sure all of these cables are connected up properly. So not only plugging in the cables from the fans and the radiator, but also running the USB cable, PCIe power, and the CPU fan cable through the system as well. So you do need to make sure that all of those are plugged in. The USB connection runs to the bottom of the motherboard, and then the other cables will plug in thusly. So you need to run this small little cable up to the top of the case. And as I showed you earlier on in the video, what we're looking to do here is to plug this into the CPU fan header. Then we've got a PCIe power connection, so that plugs into the controller and make sure it clicks all the way into place fully there. It's a little bit fiddly, can be a little bit fiddly to do, but once you've done that, you can then nestle that cable away and tie it down. Make sure it's nice and tidy at the rear there. There is plenty of space, as you can see, luckily in this case. Then you run that small little cable up to the CPU fan header on the motherboard, which at this point is pretty fiddly to get to, as you can see. But essentially what this does is it allows the motherboard to recognize as a CPU cooler in place. You'll often find if you don't plug it into the CPU fan header, that the system will then complain the BIOS might not let you get to Windows because it's basically saying, hey, there's no CPU cooler recognized. Then the USB connection goes into the bottom right or bottom middle of the motherboard, depending on your motherboard. This is important so you can control the RGB lighting via Corsair's iCue software. Now for the setup of the ROG Astral 5090, we're going to install this into the system, set it up with that vertical GPU mount and get it ready for gaming with. This is quite a large card, as you can imagine, and a deep one too, which presents a little bit of a problem in a little while and did cause me some separate issues, which I talked about in a different video. But it does fit, as you'll see. It will fit into the system and it will work, and it still does run nicely and is cooled quite effectively by the fans in the system as we're going to set them up too. So it will be installing onto this vertical bracket, which I'm happy to report is a PCIe Gen 5 riser cable, which means it will work with the latest GPUs that include PCIe Gen 5. What you do is you basically slotting your graphics card into that bracket and then securing it at the rear with some screws. So from the top view, you can see how that works. Basically, carefully slot the graphics card into that PCIe bracket. And then on the left-hand side, there's a couple of screws. So you've got some included screws that secure the part of the graphics card at the back into this. And you can see the holes that line up there. You need to basically screw those in so they're nice and tight in there. Then that will hold the GPU. The idea is then we will then install this into the system with the riser cable plugging into the top port of the motherboard. Now what I've discovered here is because of the size of the GPU, I actually ended up having to remove the fan bracket from here so that I could then slot the riser into it, slot the riser cable in and the vertical mount for it. Take care when doing this as well that you don't damage the plastic on the fan tray, because it's pretty easy to accidentally scratch that, I discovered as well. So you push the riser cable into the top PCIe slot on the motherboard and put that cable in, and then you slot the vertical mount down into the position where you had it originally, remembering that it has 3 little tiny screws that secure it around the outside of it, and then you've got a couple of thumb screws on the inside of the case that secure that bracket. Now you can actually adjust the vertical bracket when it's secured like this, you can pull it backwards and forwards, so you can move it forward towards the front glass or back towards the motherboard. Because the Astral's pretty chunky, what I'd recommend doing is basically sliding it forward as much as possible to get it away from the motherboard, because it does end up putting some heat out, obviously, and pushing it towards the motherboard could then negatively impact things. And I did find that that caused one of my drives to overheat. But if you get it closer to the glass, pull it close towards those front fans, and then secure it with the screws, so those thumb screws that screw into these ports here on the left hand side, as you can see, you can then secure that down so that it's set up and ready to basically hold that GPU in place properly. You might notice some sag to the GPU at this point as it's laying down, but obviously once you stand it back up again, it's fine. And then we're plugging the 600 watt cable into that port. Now take care to make sure it's pushed all the way in so that you can't see the blue pins on these connectors anymore. You need to make sure that's pushed all the way in, and also that there isn't loads of additional pressure on that cable. You don't want it to be pulled out. And then that's what that final build would be set up, and that's what that's like. Now, as I said, I did a thermal test on this system, which I covered in the review of the cooler, so I'd recommend checking that out, and subscribe to see the review of the case as well if you're curious. But if you wanted to, I want to show you an option for how to install the radiator on the side instead. So there are 3 screws holding the side tray in place. Now this tray is generally used for SSDs and hard disk drives, which you'd install in there. However, if you take it off and then you remove a couple of screws per bay, so there's 2 little screws on each of these, you can then remove each of these trays, basically pop them out of the way, and then in place of those you can either put additional fans or a radiator. So you could put 3 additional fans on here, for example, and have them on the side as intake, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is install the radiator on the side instead. So the idea here is what we're going to do is swap the fans on the rad again and install it with reverse blade fans on the radiator, so it's intaking air into the rad and keeping it cool. Now you have options in installing the tubes at the top or tubes at the bottom. Obviously a 420mm radiator will fit nicely on the side here. However, what I found is that most people like to do tubes at the bottom because they're worried about air build-up in the pump over time. But with this one, it's actually just not possible, or at least the tubes are very tight. I can see that they're very tight running to the pump, and I know this is going to be a problem because the depth of 5090 is actually going to end up pressing against those tubes, and it's going to be an issue. So for this build, instead, I'm going to mount it with the tubes at the top. Now, as mentioned, I'm going to use reverse blade fans on the radiator instead of the standard blade. The idea being that these will then be pulling cool air from the rear of the case through the radiator, cooling the coolant down inside and helping to cool the CPU. If you left them with the fans, the standard fans installed on it like this, it would then be an exhaust radiator on the side. You'd have 4 intake fans on the case and then 3 exhausts on the side here. I find that's not optimal. It's better to use reverse blade fans on it. Now, in a lot of builds, this makes quite a bit of difference. I actually found this wasn't as good as I was expecting in this build, but it's still an interesting option if you want to add extra fans into the system. You have the ability to do it. But basically making sure that the fan connectors, so the power connectors, are in the same place when you replace these fans, that they line up perfectly with where you're going to mount them on the radiator. Because don't forget, we need to plug in the cables as we did before on the rad and plug them into the fan set up on the radiator to make sure it's all linked up properly. So just make sure you're replacing like for like essentially, and then mount the radiator to that rear tray. So you can either do this when the tray's out of the case, or you can do it like this, hold the rad in place and then use the small screws to secure the radiator back to that tray. As you can see, it can easily take this 420mm radiator at the rear there, so it's pretty easy to set up and install it this way. However, I did make a mistake, and I want to note that I forgot to connect the power cable from the fans on one end so that I could then run them to other fans, because what I should have logically done is run the cable from these fans on the radiator to the bottom fans, and I forgot to do that, because that then presents a problem. And that's the issue with this case. You have to plan out the wiring of it as well. So I'm running the cable back through to the controller from the radiator, obviously, so the fans on the radiator are fine, but the additional fans at the bottom then become a problem in terms of the wiring. So I've taken the exhaust fans, so these are standard blade fans, and I'm putting them at the top of the case now in place of where the radiator was before. So the cable that runs from those rear fans is connected up to these top fans so that they're then chained together. And then I'm going to screw these into that top radiator tray instead. So we're screwing those fans in up at the top there using the Corsair fan screws and securing them to the top of the case. So now what we've got is 3 intake fans on the bottom tray below the GPU, 1 intake fan at the rear, and then 3 intake fans on the AIO, and then these exhaust fans at the top. But what this means is because of the way I've wired things in, I end up having to use an additional controller here, which is obviously not ideal. So I've got the cable running from the radiator with the 3 fans on it, and then I've got another cable from those bottom fans on that bottom tray running to the other side of the controller, the black controller. And then for the white controller, I'm going to be running the cables from the rear and top fans to it. So this is why I had to put that in, because I wasn't able to connect all the fans together. If I had worked out a way to do it and it had been easy, then I would have been able to get away with just using 1 controller, which would be preferable, because otherwise you need 2 USB connections and 2 PCIe power connections. So you need 2 spare power cables from your power supply unit and 2 spare ports on your motherboard for the USB connection as well. So I'm running this long cable from the controller here up to the top and plugging it in on the other end of those fans you just saw me mount to the top of the case. So the idea being that this is then running from those fans, and then there's a cable at the end of those fans running from that to the rear fan, that's then running from that to the bottom fan, so that all those fans are then connected to the white controller and controlled that way. You can see that you can run the cable up though through the top of the case and then back down again, so it's on the inside. So you can actually hide the cables away quite nicely like that. So rather than having to run them into the case and expose them and make them visible, you can actually run them around the outside mostly to pretty much hide them away. So it is possible to do and to neaten things up. But if I'd planned this out better, I could have done it without having to use 2 controllers. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your build. And that's the final product of how it looks. I actually think this looks nicer because it's filling out obviously the side there. If you're not using any hard disk drives or SSDs, you can make the most of this, either installing intake fans on the side or a radiator as I've done here, and then you're basically adding in a lot of RGB and a lot of nice cooling as well. So that is the final setup. As a reminder, all the specs of this build are in the description if you want to find out more about what's included or what to use with your system. I'm also going to do a full review on the case, so subscribe to see that. And if you want to see the thermal performance of the cooler, then I've done a review on that separately, and I'm also doing a video on the 5090 as well. Hopefully this has helped. I realise it's been a long video. If you've made it all this way, let me know in the comments down below if you found it helpful, or if there's anything you wish I'd covered in more depth. Thanks very much for watching, appreciate you.